Hello, everybody. I'm going to make our last lecture video, um, chapter 31. We're getting into very close to contemporary art, and I have thrown in two things at the end, or a couple things at the end from contemporary art that we'll cover, but then that's it. We just don't have time to go through it. Hopefully, you enjoyed flipping through the chapter and finding your own images to talk about on the discussion board. All right, so we're talking about abstract expressionism here. We've been coming to this for a while with artists such as Turner, the Impressionists, Picasso, and Kandinsky in particular, who was the guy who thought of his paintings like music. And he sort of took the subject out of his paintings, which is what abstract expressionism is. So, abstract expressionism is based on strict formalism, and formalism is the elements and the principles of art. If you're an art major, you know all about this. We're talking about line, shape, color, value, form, texture, and then all of the other things: harmony, rhythm, unity, repetition, etc. So these things will be talked about rather than what's in it, not religion, not history, not even, the artist himself, just what you're actually seeing visually. And in general, this is where we get this language to talk about art. We need a whole other way to talk about art rather than, what's going on inside of it. So that's the one thing is it's made to be looked at on its own, but also to express the artist's state of mind, and hopefully you yourself would have some kind of reaction to the work of art as well. So it includes both the viewer and the artist. This is one of the first times where critics have embraced the movement as it was getting started. Clement Greenberg was a very well known art historian and writer and art critic, and he knew all of the New York abstract expressionists. He hung out with them. Um, and he wrote a lot about the movement and sort of got it very widely accepted. This is not like Whistler or um, even Picasso at first, where people would have a negative reaction to this. Most people um, respected Greenberg and took his word for it that this is, something worth looking at. And he, made a lot of, he wrote a lot of books and articles on the movement so that people would understand it a little bit more than, sort of going into a museum and saying, a child could do this, which I hear a lot. You can think that if you want, but he sort of elevated it to more of a loftier pursuit. And this is his quote from the book. And we're going to remember these words: non-figurative, meaning there's no figures in it. There's nothing in there. It's going to become, um, the medium itself is going to become the subject, is what that quote is all about. And we saw the Impressionists sort of start this already, the idea that painting should be painting. But the Impressionists obviously were making scenes of everyday life, leisurely activities of rich people doing things. Abstract Expressionists do things like this. This is the famous artist Jackson Pollock. And you can see there's no visible subject to talk about. I can't talk about, the church being in a certain place, or the religious scene, or the outdoor scene, or who's in it, or who's important, or the king. This is literally just what we might say line and shape and color. We might perceive space a little bit with all this overlapping. And these are formal elements. This is the language we need to talk about something like this. This is number one. And Jackson Pollock often used numbers and titles. I feel that he often still thought he needed to justify what he was doing, so he calls this lavender mist, um, so that you will have something to hang on to. Of course, it has lavender in it, and it sort of looks like sort of so overlapping, like things are fuzzy, like mist. And this was a very famous painting. This actually was the highest selling painting for a while. It was like 1.8 $8 million, I think, for this painting. And it's a large painting, but this is how he made his paintings. He considered these to be action paintings. He would put his canvas on the floor or lean it against a wall. You can see this one here, or hang it on the wall. He didn't have it on a stretcher yet. They would be put on stretchers after he made them, so that he could walk all around it, because he hasn't even unrolled this canvas. He could keep making it bigger and bigger. Um, and here he is painting, and this is a video I show on the seated classes if you want. There's many videos of Jackson Pollock being interviewed and making these paintings. He was sort of a media darling. He was on, the cover of Time magazine. He was famous in his own time. People love this art style. I feel like students don't often love it, but I hope you at least respect it. So this is how he called them drippings. He would throw it. He would walk around it and throw things into it. He would pour the paint. He would drip the paint. He was very active while he made these paintings. Um, he's kind of a tragic figure. He dies young. He had a terrible bout with alcoholism, and he actually got into a drunk driving accident when he was 44 and died, which is another reason why sometimes he's thought of as being so famous. But he was famous while he was alive too. This is his wife, or it was his wife, Lee Krasner, who was also a painter, and she worked alongside him and with all the other New York abstract expressionists. They sort of had a school. They all knew each other. They hung out with Greenberg, the art critic, and they were a movement. They were like other people that we've seen, like the Impressionists. They understood what each other was doing. They had a variety of it, but they had sort of the same program. And you can see Lee Krasner uses more sort of giant organic shapes and sketchy colors for hers. You could make a case for some of these are figurative. These kind of look like faces, or, this looks like a woman's body in a way, but it's still an abstraction. We want to make sense of things sometimes that aren't really there. This is Willem de Kooning. Even though he was a little bit figurative, he actually called his series Women. They're total abstractions of a figure, but he's lumped in with the abstract expressionists because he came to New York escaping the Nazis, and he stayed in New York and worked alongside all of them. They all hung out together. Um, and knew each other, and he was part of that group, so he's sort of lumped in with them. And you can see a lot has been written about William de Kooning. His sort of violent images about women. Um, there was sort of he's almost like an anti-feminist in a way. He makes very sort of crude and angry depictions of women. And the fact was, he had a wife. Elaine de Kooning was an artist too. He didn't seem to have any issues with women, but his paintings seem um, to point at that, and a lot has been written about that about him. Um, and funny, when I was just looking at something, this popped up for de Kooning. A film came up in South by Southwest as a film. Series that like Cannes Film Festival, and this painting here was at the University of Arizona, and this suburban couple just walked right in and took it off the wall and stole it, and it was found much later. So that movie's not out yet. Look for it in the future. I can't wait. Robert Motherwell was friends with all of the they're called NYABXs, the New York Abstract Expressionists. If you have time, go ahead and check out Khan Academy on this painting, Elegy to the Spanish Republic. It explains it very well. He is reacting to a travesty that has happened in the Spanish War, in his abstract ways. This is some of the colors of the Spanish flag are back here, but you can see he's using these giant slashes of black and these big organic shapes in front of. They are overlapping. They seem to be blocking the color. So he's creating space, right? So I'm talking about color, line, shape, space. These are all formal elements, right? This is how we have to talk about this stuff. Um, and he often used mostly black and white. He did introduce a little color, and he worked alongside the next artist, Franz Klein, in this way, where uh, they thought of color as sort of a distraction from um, what they wanted line to be doing, because as you probably know, color is the most dynamic element. Most people want to look at color or talk about color, and they wanted um, line to do the work of that. So here's that title. New York School Abstract Expressionists, and these are called gestural abstractions, right? Gesture is like when you're working very quickly and you make a movement. So this is what it refers to. And this is Franz Klein, who worked alongside all of them as well. His is his Mahoning in 1956. And he gets rid of most colors. He considers his work more spiritual. He does this sort of yin and yang thing. He likes the purity of black and white. And these slides can't do it justice. These are gigantic paintings. You can see him standing amongst them. And most of the abstract expressionists worked in a very large scale. Um, so it's meant to overwhelm you. It's meant to give you, a visceral experience with the work of art that we can't really experience by looking at a little slide. We have to stand in front of the painting and be sort of overwhelmed by it, or interact with the object itself. Barnett Newman, and I have taken out a lot of the artists, so I'm not just stacking them up here, because these artists are sort of doing the more important things. Barnett Newman is making these, or was making these, what he calls, well, they're abstract paintings, but he calls these little lines here zips. And he thought that these little zips introduced sort of like this pacing, this more of a rhythm um, in the work. And these are gigantic as well. Um, he liked he sometimes modeled the paintings in there, but mostly it seemed like it was sort of like one solid color. And you can see here these people sitting in a museum, and this is it's mostly blue, a little black here, and then there's the zip. It actually looks, as if it's um, separated. And the difference between Newman and Rothko, the next artist we're going to look at, is one always did things horizontally and one always did things vertically. That will be the way to tell. And Mark Rothko likes these sort of fuzzy um, edges on his works of art. His often look more like what we think about as landscape, because once you put things, a horizontal line in big areas, somebody's going to look at it and think of it as, a horizon. And they do look like they are sort of little abstract landscapes, but you can see the size of this thing is gigantic. And I have to say, he's one of my favorite. I find his work very sort of pleasing to look at. And they become very, very simple. And he saw color, this is a quote from him, as a doorway to another reality. That color could express basic human emotions. If you look at just color relationships, then you miss the point. So he wants these to be doorways, not for you to just look at them as surface colors, but as a doorway into an experience, an emotion. And we've seen that before. We saw Gauguin come up with nondescriptive color, this symbolic color with the yellow Christ and the vision after the sermon. So art history is a continual, building up on things. Um, Rothko was asked by a wealthy patron to come to Houston and make gigantic paintings for a chapel. Um, sort of like a chapel that you would go in and meditate in. It's not really a religious chapel. So, these Abex guys are very, very famous in their own time in New York. People love them, and they sold a lot of art. They were collected by, people like Peggy Guggenheim, and the Museum of Modern Art is starting in New York City as well. So there's a home for these things. It's just the right thing at just the right time. This is post World War II, where everybody's sort of like ready for change, ready for freshness in all of life, not just art. Helen Frankenthaler is what we call a color field painting. And she liked to, a little similar to Jackson Pollock, sort of pour on the painting and let it soak in so that the edges were sort of, random, made by the materials themselves. Um, and so this is a little bit more, um, she's more formalist than expressive because she's deciding what color to put next to what color. She's making formal decisions without saying that she is expressing something of her own emotions because the material is doing the work once she decides on, the certain parts of the formal parts. Another female artist we look at is Bridget Riley, who is not, I mean, we can call this abstract. It is abstract, it's not a subject, but she liked to play with, I should have put a disclaimer on this. This might irritate somebody's eyes. Op art. She likes to play with spacing of, we could talk about this formally. These are shapes, circles, and then we have, the spacing. It's a pattern, circles and a pattern, black and white. They have some value. They seem to have some like highlights on them. But if you play with the spacing, it creates a false illusion of space here, as if the whole thing's folding in. So she's, toying with the elements to create an optical illusion. We saw the Renaissance do their best with, linear perspective to create the illusion of space. Um, this is exactly what Bridget Riley is doing with just the formal elements. And here's another one of hers. We don't have a headache yet. Let's keep going. This is David Smith's QB. So we have abstract sculpture. So reducing the work of art to just the formal elements, right? That's what abstract expressionism is. So, of course, we have geometric shapes, we have, repetition, we have scale and proportion. These are all the formal elements. This is how you would talk about this work of art. Even though it seems like an abstraction, once you get a vertical thing like a trunk and things branching out, you might say this is an abstraction of a tree. Mostly because it's in a place where there are other trees. He also, David Smith, liked to play with the material. He had been a welder at an automobile plant, and then he went on to become a sculptor. So he liked to use steel, and he liked to do different textures to the surface so that it reflected light and color in different ways. And he was very successful. These are in sculpture gardens of rich people and museums all over the world, really. Um, Sometimes he used white, sometimes he used black. Some of them, these are earlier ones. He got into all different, he started making more organic ones later in his life. So this idea of outdoor sculpture, there has been outdoor, so all of the Davids that we looked at in the Renaissance were meant for outdoors. They were just brought inside once they were admired so much. Um, so Smith is working in the same, realm as the Renaissance artists. This is Louise Nevelson. If you're uh, in the 3D class here at the college, this you've probably made something. You know who this is because you made a sculpture similar, or you will make a sculpture similar to this one. These are architecture-like assemblages, and we've seen assemblages before with Duchamp. Um, so this is Louise Nevelson putting together a whole bunch of random things, formal elements. She's finding things that are curved next to circles. So repeating this, shape here, and these are all different proportions of boxes. And then we have, these geometric shapes here, etc. These are all the formal ways of talking about this. And then she reduces the color palette completely. So this is monochromatic, which is one color plus black and white. And these are all the formal ways you talk about this. We're not talking about, what it is, all the particular parts. We're talking about, the overall structure, the formal elements. And she calls this Sky Cathedral. And hopefully you can see there's some similarities to a cathedral as well. Another abstract sculptor is sort of the opposite of those geometric forms of Louise Nevelson is Louise Bourgeois. And these are her cumuli, like clouds. And she herself made many statements that she wants her work to be sexually suggestive. You can see these are very kind of figurative. They look maybe like female forms or female parts. Um, she has like a very reduced surface texture because it's so matte and flat looking, or flat in texture. And then she puts it on this wood as sort of a juxtaposition of smooth versus, the roughness of the wood, maybe possibly, feminine versus masculine in this. Right. So when we're talking about texture, we talk about repetition, we're talking about shape. These are all the formal elements. This is how we talk about abstract expressionism. But don't worry, the figure comes back into art. Most people use the figure still, or the figure or the object, the subject comes back. So we're going to talk about pop art now. Um, and the biggest inventor of this is Andy Warhol, who, um, well, let's start with his background. So pop art is a movement that started in the 1950s. It starts in America. It does travel to Britain. Um, and this is the pop refers to this idea of popular culture. And pop as in it pops, it visually pops. There's a lot of contrast. When if you're in an art class, you say, give it some pop. It means give it, like, make it stand out a little bit more, give it some visual interest. So it refers to both of those. And it's also sort of a very comic book kind of thing to use, and we'll see why. And Andy Warhol liked to use elements of graphic advertisement, especially his use of color. So when Andy Warhol was little, he grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you went to this store in, where he lived, you would go to a mom and pop shop, and say you wanted cereal, you would get your choice of, you want cornflakes or do you want oatmeal. There wasn't a plethora of choices. There was, you got what you got in a way. It was just a few brands of everything. What more do you need? Hot or cold cereal? That's all you need. But post-war, because America's factories had not been, destroyed by by war, all of these things were still in place. All the factories that popped up to help in the war efforts, and the women in the workplace. There's all this stuff ready to go for some other means, and what that means will be is all of these factories will turn into assembly lines and mass produced consumer goods. So in the 1940s, when the country is recovering from the Depression, uh, when Andy Warhol was around, and then he starts working in the 50s, we have this explosion of things happening, things that people can buy. Um, and this didn't happen in his, by the time he died, certainly a supermarket would look like this, but we know where this goes, this consumerism. Now, if you want cereal, and you've never had cereal, I don't know where you would come from if you hadn't, but you would be at a total loss at the grocery store trying to just choose one. Um, so so Andy Warhol is sort of reacting to this idea that suddenly we go from, 0 to 100 very quickly in his life. And there's this other thing happening, and that is TV. Um, Certainly not everybody had a TV when he was, even a little older. But by the time he's well into his pop art style, he is actually making, films and things like that. He loves this idea of the moving image and TV, and with TV comes advertisement, and with all this consumerism comes advertisement. If you're going to have a lot of products being made, then you will need to advertise and compete. So Andy Warhol is reacting to all of this stuff happening in this country. And this is the one from your book, The Maryland Diptych. And you can see that What Andy Warhol really liked to do is to repeat things. And one of the reasons, of course, he does is because of advertisement. That's the goal, is you would keep an ad running, or you would want it to be seen everywhere. Sometimes it seems like he's trying to overload you with the image. Maybe that's how he felt. But um, he just took anything that was popular and made it into art. So, of course, the Coca-Cola company was very popular, still is. Uh, some of these things are still incredibly popular. That's good advertisement. This is probably his most famous one, the tomato soup can. And he would often make, hundreds of these and display them together. And you can see, hopefully, that, one of the reasons why he would do this is to make it look like a supermarket, right? They're on display. So this would be an ad for it, but then this is an actual, imitation of the supermarket shelf. Andy Warhol did not create um, this label, right? He's not the graphic designer. He just has simply taken an everyday object and elevated it to art status, which is kind of odd to think. Like now, it's like anything can be art. Why not a soup can? And same thing here with the green Coca-Cola bottles. This one is from your book. One is not enough. You'll need many, 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 many. It's a reflection of consumerism in this country at this time. Andy Warhol actually called his art studio the factory. Um, and he silk screened his things, which is how you make t-shirts. So he ran his studio like a factory. And he had many students from around the country. Lots of people wanted to come and work for him, usually for free. And they were all part of a production line. And he sometimes did a very small part of this. Um, and I often think, like, well, is Andy Warhol's point that this is a good thing? Is it all too much? And this isn't an Andy Warhol, but I like to put that in this slide. Uh, You can watch, there's plenty of documentaries on Andy Warhol. There's actually a new Netflix one. I haven't really seen it. I think it talks more about his films and his personal life. But there's a movie called I Shot Andy Warhol. He was shot. I mean, he was quite a celebrity in this country during his time. And you could see from his photograph I showed, he very much enjoyed being his own, work of art everywhere he went. This is another pop artist, Roy Lichtenstein, and you can hopefully see that he takes his style directly from comic books. And he had quite a sense of humor. And we could still talk about these with the formal elements. We can talk about the use of color. Obviously, he's using primary colors. The use of line. We have, implied line. We have thick and thin lines. We have a variety of lines. We can talk about direction. We can talk about pattern. We can talk about these in a formal way, but there is a subject to talk about as well. And that is that this is, supposed to be a popular um, image from a popular thing, comic books, which used to be very popular. Um, so he often depicted women, in distress. Like he's making fun of the typical roles that women would be put in a movie or a book. They're often saying like really just silly romantic things because they're just silly women. Of course, he is making fun of this whole idea. He's not embracing it. These red dots are called Ben-Day dots. What he's doing is he's imitating the color printing process that would have been for comics. Comics often had these Ben-Day dots on them to create this like um, skin tone. And this is the one from your book. And some of these are smaller, but this is like I don't even know, 20 feet long, I think. So it's like a giant comic come to life as if the comic book is open here. And he loves to do the, if you're going to have a comic of the wham and the diagonals and foreshortening, um, this is, he had a good sense of humor. And then pop art as sculpture, we have Klaus Oldenburg, and this is his lipstick. You can see that he's, um, it's like you're going to go to war and get a man, I guess. I'm not sure what the statement is. So, but most of his like this seems very deep and meaningful, but most of his sculpture is just kind of whimsical. He takes smaller everyday objects and elevates them to monumental status, as if they are big, giant, important things that you need to look at. Um, and it's just this one's in Minneapolis. These are all over. He was very prolific. I can't remember where this. I think Buffalo. These giant matchbook here. Yes, sculpture you can walk on. You gotta enjoy that. But Andy Warhol was very influential to many artists, including street artists of New York. Andy lived in New York and then he traveled to LA. He met Basquiat, who was a street artist. Basquiat actually, there's a good movie on Basquiat. He had a tragic life as well. He had his own addiction issues. And so they met, and Andy Warhol was a great proponent of him, and he became very famous in his own life. And he had this very sort of graphic graffiti style that Andy Warhol immediately like introduced him to a gallery, and he became very famous. He also did these heads, and then Keith Haring is another street artist who was influenced by pop art. Um, you have seen something similar. I've seen these on T-shirts and hats all the time. If you don't know who it is, it's Keith Haring. Um, let's go back. Where's Keith Haring's name? Sorry. Keith Haring, Haring, did these sort of outlines of figures. He often, it looks like it's very fun and funny, but he has very, meaningful messages um, about homophobia, about racism. I mean, he deals with a lot of issues in his whimsical looking artwork, and he literally was a street artist going around illegally putting these figures all over the subways of New York until, of course, he landed in a gallery and made a lot of money. And these are some of his as well. So Keith Haring is influenced by Andy Warhol, and Matt Groening is influenced by Keith Haring. So we have this trickle down of pop art to other things. Bart Simpson will not be on your final exam. Other art is very influenced by pop art as well, and that is taking popular images and making them into art. But we're going to look at this style called superrealism, and in some cases it will be called photorealism. And Dwayne Hansen is the sculptor that is in your book. Dwayne Hansen uses these incredible um, plasticky figures that look real. They are life size and they look incredibly real. It's hard to tell like what the material actually is. He puts real clothing on them. These are all, real boxes and things. And he places them in odd places. Sometimes, a lot of times they're in museums now. So if you saw this in a museum, you would not be fooled to think that that woman was in the museum. But sometimes they're outside, or sometimes they're um, just in places that they actually would fool people. And hopefully you can see this as he's making fun of popular culture in a way. He's making fun of consumerism. So it's not really embracing it. I think Dwayne Hansen often is, he's making fun of it. And a lot of times he seems to be making fun of a certain class of people, a certain age of people. There's many older people that he makes. These are called the tourists, and you can. I mean, they are. This is super realism. If you saw these people, at the airport, you wouldn't know that they were, anything other than just people at the airport, or these people sitting in the museum as if they're on a museum bench. I always think these two people belong in Nighthawks, the painting. and just some more. I mean, these are just incredible. So super realism, more than realism. Chuck Close called his stuff photorealism. Photorealism, and this is an acrylic on canvas. This is not a photograph. The whole goal of photorealism is to make a painting that looks like a photograph, not just to look like the thing. And there's a little bit of a difference. It usually has an extra glossy surface. It has a slight bit of distortion. So again, it's not meant to look like the real thing, like say um, the Dutch still lifes looked exactly like the thing. This is meant to look like a photograph of the thing. And Chuck Close was very uh, successful at this. He made gigantic portraits. Made a lot of self portraits. He made famous people, um, and he changed his style after a while. You should look him up. He's very interesting. And these aren't in your book. This is Richard Estes. Um, Goes out of his way to choose. These are paintings. He goes out of his way to choose things that are very complicated as far as reflections, and he makes paintings of them, paintings that look like photographs of these things. Just incredible skill. Just a couple more things for the class. A few things happening in art, um, or have been happening in art, I should say. Feminist art or feminist approach to art is dealing with, you know, women's roles in both art and in society. And of course, it takes a woman artist to do this. So, this is Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. This is probably the ultimate feminist work of art. This is the one from your book. And at this dinner party, you see this triangle, and a triangle is associated with female parts. Um, it's 39 women from ancient times to 20th century. Judy Chicago considers this to be an interpretation of the Last Supper, where women are honored guests. It celebrates the achievements of individual women that are there. And then it's also calling attention to this oppression of like a dinner party. It would be the woman's role to make the dinner, to clean up after the dinner, the oppression of women. Their domestic role is what the dinner is also referring to. And then the foundation in between, I'll show you that, has 999 other names of women. Here you can see um, who who also in history have done important things. And so it's like these women at the party have a foundation of strong women who are literally holding them up, who have held them up and led them to this. And here are some of these. This is Artemisia Gentileschi's plate. This one here is Virginia Woolf, the writer. This one here is Georgia O'Keeffe, the artist. Right. So these are all lots of women artists and writers, etc. There's Queen Theodora from Byzantine age, all kinds of important women in history. Cindy Sherman is another feminist artist. This is her photograph from, she preferred to work in photography. She did make films as well. She did an untitled film stills series of 80 black and white photographs. This is number 35. And in this series, she shows she herself. She is always in the photograph. I believe in every single one of her photographs, not just this series, but every one of them, where she is taking control of her image. She's poking fun of or criticizing, not necessarily fun, these traditional roles or stereotypes of women in movies. And she's brilliant. She does everything. The whole production is hers. So she's just brilliant at makeup and, staging and, everything. Like she's doing everything. She's directing it, the lighting, the posing, everything. And so here's two more from that series. And in a lot of cases, she's unrecognizable. Um, and she does do color photography. She does many different series. This is also Cindy Sherman, and she's not at this point. She's younger, but she's not as young as she's making herself seem. This though is I'm not sure if it still is. I have to look that up. In 1981, it was sold as the most money ever gotten for a photograph, and they were asking 1.5 at the beginning of the auction, and somebody paid almost $4 million for this photograph. That's something. Architecture, we're only going to cover two things. Architecture changes drastically during this time. People are being very experimental. Frank Lloyd Wright, who we looked at in the last chapter with his falling water and his Roby house with all his, very geometric cantilevers and open floor plan. He designs the museum for Peggy Guggenheim, who is, this is the Solomon and Peggy Guggenheim Museum. Peggy Guggenheim is the one who's out collecting all this modern art. And now she has Frank Lloyd Wright, her and her husband have Frank Lloyd Wright build this museum. So it is a private museum, not a publicly funded museum like, say, the Louvre. And you can see it's all circular. And I should have got a photograph. If you're in the building, you can see down from the bottom to the top, and all the artwork and galleries are all around the circle. So you're continuously walking down. You take the elevator up, and you're continuously walking sort of down ramps to get down to the bottom. And a very similar thing happening. This is the Sydney Opera House. You've probably seen this as a famous building. Um, it starts, looks like it's exploding in a way. And this is, great acoustics for the opera house. But it's also, almost like an abstract architecture. Both of these buildings can be talked about as if we're talking about abstract art. We can talk about the shape. We can talk about the movement. We can talk about the color, the balance. We can talk this about the rhythm. Um, so our architects are reacting to what has happened in the art world. Another big thing that starts happening is environmental art. This is the Spiral Jetty by Robert Smithson, and you can see artists are, this is a whole new sort of material or genre of sculpture in a way, where you go out and you sort of superimpose art onto the world, into the environment. And this is sometimes exposed and sometimes not exposed, and they have to keep working on that. I'm not sure if it's still there actually. Christo and his wife Jean Claude are a couple that go around, and they have wrapped, they call these wrappings, many, many things. These are islands that they have wrapped. They wrapped big buildings. They have made walls, uh, fabric walls. They deal in fabric. And you can see all these islands here. So they're all wrapped. So this is environmental art. It's like large scale monumental sculpture, sort of like acting upon the land. It's strange to say like environmental art is, it sounds like it's going to be so green. It's not really what it's meant to be. We have just two more works of art to look at. And these sort of wrap up lots of issues that we've looked at with art history. This is One and Three Chairs by Joseph Kosuth. I think this is the next chapter. Um, and this is sort of three different versions of a chair, and I'm doing air quotes. So here we have the three-dimensional chair, and then we have the two-dimensional replica of the chair. So this is the image of the thing, and then we have the description of the thing. And words and descriptions are abstract, right? They're an abstraction. You put together these letters and they're a word, and language is an abstraction. So we have all different versions, sculpture, image, and some kind of interpretation of the thing. So it's sort of calling attention to like what are images, what's real, that kind of thing. What we've been looking at, we've seen many, many things have like asked this as well, including visually. We've seen, Velasquez follow his work of art around with Las Meninas, who's where, what's happening kind of thing. This is what Joseph Kossuth is doing. And the last image we'll look at is this, Mark Tansey, and this is a short history of modernist painting. Mark Tansey is a very interesting artist. He's one of my favorites. He loves to play with issues of art history. He's constantly poking fun at this idea um, of art history. What is image making? How do we talk about art? Who's famous? That kind of thing. And so here you can describe this yourself. If you, this is a woman, you know, acting upon a window, and of course, this is modernist painting. Is it a window? Is a painting a window into another world? Until the 1900s, it seemed like that was what painting was anyway. Right? You're looking into this illusion, this a new illusion of space. It's a window. And then we have this guy here who is, banging his head against the wall. This is most likely supposed to be abstract expressionism or something about the artist acting upon something. So, is art a window into the world, another world, an illusion? Is it self expression? Or is it a mirror that holds up to the world, right? Say, like the Romanticists. We have Jericho painting the Raft of the Medusa. That's a mirror into what is happening in the world. It's also a window, it's an illusion of the mirror, um, where he is expressing his thing. So it could be all three, right? So even though this looks kind of silly, these juxtapositions of Tansey's, it's kind of deep and meaningful about, what is art, not just the history of modernist painting, but the history of painting itself. All right, I will get your review sheet ready for the final and more instructions following. Thank you.